Good afternoon, and welcome to The Writer's Role, communicating climate engineering to a public audience. I'm Jamais Cascio. I'll be your moderator this afternoon. I am a futurist. I work out of primarily with the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California. And I actually started writing about geoengineering back in 2004, although at the time I hadn't heard that term and I was calling it re-terraforming because I'm a science fiction geek. We have a really wonderful collection of writers up here with us today, and they're each going to read a brief selection of some of their work on geo. And then we're going to talk. We're going to have a good conversation, I think, about what kinds of challenges and provocations we face doing this kind of writing. So I'd like to actually start with Oliver. If you want to get up and let us hear from you.
Hi, I'm Oliver Morton. I'm a working journalist. I also write books on the side. I have been for some time writing a book about geoengineering, which will be finished later this year. I wanted to read you a little bit near the beginning of it. The book has an introduction, which is, I hope not dry, but somewhat grounded. This is the beginning of chapter 1 of the book, which is the point at which the book, I hope, goes some way towards taking flight. It begins with two quotations. It's called The Top of the World. First quotation. One might say that immensity is a philosophical category of daydream. Daydream undoubtedly feeds on all kinds of sights, but through a sort of natural inclination, it contemplates grandeur. And this contemplation produces an attitude that is so special and in a state so unlike any other that the daydream transports the dreamer outside the immediate world to a world that has the mark of infinity. Gaston Bachelard, The Poetics of Space. The second quotation, I took month-long vacations in the stratosphere, and you know, it's really hard to hold your breath. Bruce Springsteen, Growing Up. The sun is shining, but the sky above is Bible black. It takes on color only lower down, first deep violet, then, just above the encircling horizon, a band of blue and white. The descending, brightening sweep of color gives a swelling curve to the sky. 22 kilometers below, within that encompassing blue-white band, the sunlit earth, too, is curved. It bends away in every direction towards its blue-lipped rim. The only straight line in this whole vast, round, empty world is the wing. You are in the stratosphere, which, although is about as peripheral as a part of the Earth can be, plays a central role in the story to come. If climate geoengineering ever takes place, there is a good chance that it will take place up here in the Earth's attic. If it does not take place, it may well be for fear of the damage it could do to this bright-lit void. Even if it were not a crucial locale for geoengineering schemes, though, the stratosphere would still have much to recommend it as the starting point for a book about geopolitics and the environment, a book which looks at the way the Earth system works and ways it might work differently, a book about the boundaries between physical planets and imagined worlds. You are an inhabitant of the Earth's surface who has, in all likelihood, seen much more of that surface than your ancestors would have dreamed possible. You are probably the sort of person who can imagine crossing an ocean for a holiday. And so you think that you know the Earth. But less than a day's walk vertically above you, your planet offers an environment beyond your ken, a realm without local features or breathable air, a weatherless stack of atmospheric layers sliding around from equator to pole without storms or clouds. The rules that govern the workings of the lower atmosphere are turned on their head up here, and common sense ideas about the world you have picked up on its surface do not work. In understanding the world below, science can feel like an optional extra. Here, it is indispensable. The stratosphere is closed. It has well-defined boundaries at its base and at its top, and any level flight undertaken within it will eventually cross back on its own path. At the same time, it is all-encompassing. No bit of the world below lacks a stratosphere above. In this, it is a realm not simply described by science, but oddly akin to science itself, which is also limited but all-encompassing. Like the stratosphere, science is, in its way, alien to everyone. It is at the same time and by the same measure common to all, sheltering the just and unjust alike. It provides a viewpoint from which the world is bigger and stranger than it seems from the surface. The world thus revealed is more abstract too, and there is no denying that something is lost in that. Yet a sort of universality is gained, and a liberating rootlessness. But we cannot romp through this vast curving ballroom at will, our points of view reeling and untethered dancing giants of the mind. That is why I insist, as you look out to the blue, white, bright horizon, that you also see the wing, straight and true and almost close enough to touch, because there must be a wing. With the exception of the very occasional balloon, it is only with wings that you people rise this high into the stratosphere. And I would not ask you to picture this abstract, not quite place, this featureless more than place, without also having you acknowledge the means by which such things are seen. There are stratospheres around other planets. Mars has one, so does Jupiter and Saturn's moon Titan too. Orbiting spacecraft have measured their heights and their temperatures and sent profiles of them back to Earth. But this stratosphere is not just known from the outside in the planetary way. Up here, on the wing, you see it from within in the way that worlds are seen. This sparse environment has seen no births, though it has seen deaths, and few have spent much time here, but it has human impact. What could be seen from up here helped to determine the early course of the Cold War. The damage that might be done to this thinnest of airs did much to define the evolving global environmental consciousness of the 1970s and 1980s. Every photographer, or poet, or person who has ever treasured the quality of light just after sunset, where the blue scattering of the stratosphere comes into its own, has been touched by this planetary periphery. Like all stratospheres, the Earth's is tied to what lies below it by gravity and radiative transfer mechanisms and atmospheric dynamics. But there are also ties of history, of politics and wonder. A paramount expression of those ties is the wing, and that which the wing entails. The people who worked the riveting, who designed the cross-section, who defined the mission, who built the company that built the aircraft, who elected the politicians, who contracted for the aircraft to be built. Without all of them, you couldn't see all this. Even in a daydream of almost empty immensity, I insist on this rule. You can't imagine the end without imagining the means, and the means are human. The wingtip edges up. The harsh sun arcs gently across the sky. The heading changes.
Next up, Dagmar, would you please?
So this will be a disappointment after that, because I'm working as a newspaper journalist. The daily business is my business, and the text I read to you is first in German, and second, a complete different kind of text. It's more like trying to inform the public about what geoengineering or climate engineering is at all. It is reasoning about environmental policies, which do work, which do not work, and how they are combined or not combined. And it tries to, well, mostly explain what is going on in the debate. It is a text from 2012. It was already after the Durban Climate Conference, and that is, it takes some reference to that event too. So I will read in German. Sorry for that, but some of you even might understand what I'm reading. Mit einer Algenplage die Welt retten. Manchmal gibt es eine positive Nachricht. Die Ozonschicht wächst wieder, stellte das Atmosphärenforschungszentrum in Athen vor wenigen Tagen fest. Aber das muss nicht viel heißen. Die Ozonschicht verändert sich ständig. Mal wächst sie, mal verliert sie. Mehr verspricht dagegen die Chance auf ein neues weltweites Klimaabkommen bis 2015. Dieses Ziel ist das wichtigste Ergebnis des 17. Weltklimagipfels, der kürzlich in Durban in Südafrika zu Ende gegangen ist. Doch dass es der Welt damit gelingen könnte, die globale Erwärmung unter 2 Grad im Vergleich zum Beginn der Industrialisierung zu halten, ist zumindest ungewiss. Denn wenn die globalen Treibhausgasemissionen nicht zwischen 2015 und 2020 dramatisch zu sinken beginnen, wird es mit jedem Jahr unwahrscheinlicher, dass die Vermeidung von unumkehrbaren Klimafolgen noch abgewendet werden kann. Deshalb wird vor allem in den USA und Großbritannien immer intensiver über großtechnische Lösungen für das Problem diskutiert. Mittels Technologien, die als Geoengineering oder Klimaengineering bezeichnet werden, soll die Erderwärmung gebremst oder der Planet künstlich abgekühlt werden. Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, Direktor des Potsdam-Instituts für Klimafolgenforschung, nennt die Vorschläge in einem Kommentar für die Fachzeitschrift PNAS Ende des Schornsteins Lösungen. Diese Strategie hat im Kampf gegen das Waldsterben funktioniert. Als es darum ging, die Schwefeldioxidemissionen zu senken, haben Filter für die Industrie gereicht, um das Problem zu lösen. Das Klimasystem ist allerdings weitaus komplexer. Und tatsächlich setzen die wichtigsten Studien zum Thema, etwa der britischen Royal Society, eine groß angelegte Studie im Auftrag des Bundesforschungsministeriums sowie eine Analyse des Umweltbundesamts, sich überwiegend kritisch mit den Vorschlägen zum Geoengineering auseinander. Die Royal Society, die dem Ganzen noch am positivsten gegenübersteht, ist dennoch der Auffassung, dass an der Prioritätensetzung in der internationalen Klimapolitik nichts geändert werden sollte. An erster Stelle müsse die Senkung der globalen Treibhausgasemissionen stehen, an zweiter Stelle die Anpassung an die nicht vermeidbaren Klimafolgen und erst an dritter Stelle sollten aus Sicht der Royal Society Technologien erforscht werden, die als letzte Möglichkeit womöglich noch gebraucht würden, wenn es nicht gelinge, die Treibhausgasemissionen im notwendigen Umfang zu senken. Die geringen Erwartungen an eine globale Lösung für das Klimaproblem haben die Debatte angeheizt. Diskutiert werden vor allem zwei Varianten von großtechnischen Eingriffen ins Klimasystem. Zum einen eine Veränderung des globalen Strahlenhaushalts. Dazu zählen Methoden wie der Vorschlag des amerikanischen Energieministers Steven Chu, Straßen, Dächer und Parkplätze weltweit mit weißer Farbe zu bestreichen. Damit würde mehr Sonnenstrahlung wieder in den Weltraum abgestrahlt. Allerdings gilt der Vorschlag als einer der teuersten und am wenigsten effizientesten. Sehr viel mehr Hoffnung setzen Forscher wie Paul Crutzen, der für seine Forschungen zum Ozonloch und seine Ursachen mit dem Nobelpreis ausgezeichnet wurde, auf die Ausbringung von Schwefelverbindungen in die Stratosphäre, also die Zone in einer Höhe zwischen 10 und 20 Kilometern. Schwefelpartikel wirken wie Spiegel und würden so noch in der Atmosphäre Sonnenstrahlung in den Weltraum zurückwerfen. Auch das soll eine Abkühlung der Erde bewirken. Für Newt Gingrich, den republikanischen Präsidentschaftskandidaten in den USA, ist das die attraktivste Option, um das Klimaproblem zu lösen. Die Methode gilt als relativ preiswert und Gingrich sagt deshalb, wenn eine Eingrenzung der Erderwärmung für ein paar Milliarden Dollar im Jahr möglich sei, müssten amerikanische Normalbürger nicht mit einer Änderung ihres Lebensstils bestraft werden. Eine zweite Gruppe von Technologien versucht, Kohlendioxid aus der Atmosphäre zu entfernen. Dafür werden neben der in Deutschland sehr umstrittenen Kohlenstoffabscheidung aus Kraftwerken oder industriellen Prozessen und der darauf folgenden unterirdischen Lagerung, Carbon Capture and Storage, auch die Herstellung von Biokohle oder die Entfernung von CO2 direkt aus der Luft diskutiert. Unter Biokohle wird Biomasse verstanden, die mit unterschiedlichen Verfahren zu Holzkohle verarbeitet und dann in nährstoffarme Böden eingebracht werden soll. So soll der Freisetzungsprozess von CO2 über Hunderte von Jahren gebremst werden. In diese Kategorie gehören auch die Versuche der Eisendüngung im Meer, um die Algenbildung anzuregen und so CO2 zu binden, sobald die Algen absterben und auf den Meeresgrund absinken. Es gab mittlerweile 13, allerdings immer relativ kleinräumige und kurz angelegte Versuche mit der Eisendüngung, die ergeben haben, dass das Verfahren wohl kaum funktionieren wird. Anstatt das CO2 am Meeresgrund zu lagern, würden mehr als 80% des beim Absterben der Algen emittierten CO2s in die Atmosphäre abgegeben. Die CO2-Abscheidung aus der Luft wird mittels künstlicher Bäume diskutiert. Das Umweltbundesamt kommt bei der Bewertung der vorliegenden Ideen, die meisten Technologien sind nicht mehr als das, zu dem Schluss, dass keine mit dem Vorsorgeprinzip in Einklang zu bringen ist. Vor allem die ungeklärten rechtlichen Fragen, wie etwa, wer über den Einsatz der Technologien entscheidet, wann sie abgebrochen werden, weil unerwünschte und unerwartete Nebenwirkungen eingetreten sind, haben das Bundesamt dazu veranlasst, ein Moratorium für den Einsatz und die Erprobung dieser Technologien zu verlangen. weil ihre Auswirkungen in einem komplexen, nichtlinearen System wie dem Klima unüberschaubar seien. Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber weist darauf hin, dass die meisten diskutierten Technologien unsinnig teuer sind. Rund $1.000 pro Tonne CO2 müssten beispielsweise für die Variante mit den künstlichen Bäumen ausgegeben werden. Die teuersten Vermeidungstechnologien für CO2 kosten zwischen $20 und $50 die Tonne. Und bei Verfahren wie der Schwefelausbringung in die Stratosphäre ergeben sich Konfliktpotenziale, die schwer kalkulierbar sind, zumal dieses Ausbringungssystem über Hunderte von Jahren aufrechterhalten werden müsste, damit es nicht zu einem Klimaschock kommt. Doch wer weiß, ob die Menschen in einigen hundert Jahren noch wissen, warum sie alle paar Jahre Schwefeldioxid-Raketen in die Stratosphäre schicken sollen. Schellenhuber schreibt in seinem Kommentar, einige Staaten, wie beispielsweise Russland, könnten einen Vorteil in der Erwärmung sehen, etwa weil dadurch Rohstoffe leichter zugänglich werden könnten. That was that.
My graduate school German's a bit rusty, but as an American citizen, I always know to start worrying when I hear someone say Newt Gingrich.
It's spoken different. Sorry.
Gwynne?
Thank you. I, too, am a working journalist. I'm self-employed, so I work quite hard. And mostly what I do is, I suppose you could call it geopolitics. I do 2 columns a week. I flog them to papers around the world. They send money. It's quite a reasonable arrangement. And I hop from subject to subject. I mean, this morning I did one on the collapse of the Gaza ceasefire, that sort of thing, chasing headlines. But, you know, once in a while one wants to do something longer form, and so from time to time I write a book. Never made much money at it. And about 5 years ago I wrote this one. It's called Climate Wars. I stumbled into this whole business of what the military are thinking about climate change by visiting an old friend in Washington who's made his career in the Defense Intelligence Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, the alphabet soup of American intelligence agencies. We were sitting around in his flat one evening having a beer or 4, and he just mentioned that the Pentagon was getting interested in climate change. So I said, why? And he said, I don't know, but here's a couple of phone numbers you might like to try. And I did, and they were very much interested in climate change. This is Joint Chiefs of Staff level stuff. So I went back to London, asked around town. Within 3 days, it was clear that the British military were up to their ears in it as well. This is all about 2007-8. So I thought, oh, you know, we have a live one here, an interesting subject. I will pursue this, and I did. And over the next year, as I went various places for various purposes, probably a dozen countries. I interviewed scientists, of course. Some of you have had me on your doorstep, I'm sure. Well, I recognize some of you. And I interviewed policymakers who never tell you anything you didn't already know. And I interviewed the soldiers, and soldiers are very useful because they're rather naive about the press, which means you get more out of them than you do about the more practiced members of the community, especially recently retired soldiers. They're desperate. You know, they've had complete obedience and absolute attention to everything they said for about 20 years, and now they're in severe decompression. Even their wives don't listen to them. And when you ring up and say you want to hear their opinions, they're so grateful they give them all to you. So I did that for about a year, and then I wrote this book. And the way I wrote it was to try to get the science in there and get the science right, but to bring the politics in the form of scenarios, narrative scenarios of various situations that might arise and how the various players would respond. So what I'm going to offer you, and bear in mind this is 5 years old, so there's some bits I wouldn't do now, like how you deliver sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. I wouldn't use balloons. But I think it is still a plausible scenario for the way things might go. And this is located in, let me get the date, 2041. 2039. And it begins. The crisis had its roots in the great debate that split the West in the 2020s between those who wished to retain as much of the old way of life as possible, solving the climate change problem by a combination of conservation measures and various technological fixes such as carbon capture and sequestration and more nuclear power, and those who argued that the old way of life was the problem and that far more radical changes were necessary. It would be unfair to characterize those on the right, as they were inevitably called, as stubborn technophiles. Most had switched to an electric car or no car at all, and accepted even radical conservation measures such as the cuts in air travel as necessary. They simply argue that the current density of population could not be maintained without very large amounts of energy, so technological fixes in the energy sector were absolutely necessary. The left, similarly, were not all anti-technological Luddites. The great majority were people who just wanted to shift the emphasis further towards conservation, who did not want any more coal-fired stations, even with the promise of CCS, and who hated nuclear energy. Neither side really lost the long argument that divided both Europe and North America from about 2020 onwards, in the sense that both conservation and techno fixes played a large part in the emissions-cutting strategy of every Western nation. But the left felt that it had lost because almost all the larger countries launched major programs for building new nuclear reactors. By the early 2030s, nuclear power plants had sprung up almost everywhere, that there was adequate water for cooling the reactors. So while only a tiny handful of extremists ever resorted to violence, they enjoyed a certain sympathy from much larger numbers of people on the left. That sympathy grew as the evidence accumulated that the West's strategy on climate change was not working. A large number of coal-fired power stations had been replaced by nuclear plants. A lot of people had made a lot of money out of fighting climate change, but carbon dioxide was already at 480 parts per million by 2035, with much more to come. Killer heat waves were striking Europe and the American Midwest and Southwest several times each summer. Methane was bubbling up out of the permafrost. The ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide was down by 70% from the 2005 figure. And the Greenland glaciers were sliding into the sea so fast you could almost see them move. So the political struggle in the West moved on to the next stage, with many on the right arguing that it was time to resort to last-ditch geoengineering measures to cut down the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface and so keep the temperature down, and many on the left reacting with horrified rejection. Some form of geoengineering intervention to reduce global temperature by a degree or so was already being advocated by countries of the majority world, most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as a stopgap measure to prevent the climate from passing some critical tipping points. It was the countries of the former Third World that took the lead in this because, being nearer to the equator, they were already suffering severe losses from storm damage, rising temperatures, and collapsing agriculture. But the atmosphere is a single shared resource, so they could not legitimately interfere directly with the climate system unless the West also agreed, and the West did not. The majority world couldn't wait, having allowed a decent interval for the West to sort out its own internal divisions and begin an international discussion of how much geoengineering of which kind was needed and how soon. It acted unilaterally. On March 25th, 2039, Indonesia and the Philippines began releasing the high-altitude balloons that would replace approximately 1 megaton of sulfur per year into the stratosphere in order to drop the planet's surface temperature by 1 degree. It was not a very dramatic sight, 5 or 6 giant balloons a day, each carrying a payload of about 5 tons, disappearing rapidly into the sky from each of 100 different sites scattered across the 2 island nations. The spread of latitudes, both north and south of the equator, ensured that the sulfur dioxide was released into the tropical upward branch of the stratospheric circulation in both hemispheres. It was some days before the West even realized the scale of what was going on. China had bankrolled the operation and supplied a lot of the equipment, of course, Although Indonesia at least would have been capable of doing it alone, the technology was not at all demanding, and the annual cost was only about US $25 billion. Because it was being hit even harder by climate change than the two tropical countries, China had the most urgent need and had taken the lead. It also had the military power to ensure that nothing bad happened to the two smaller nations if the Western or Japanese reaction should take a violent form. In fact, while Western governments greeted this unilateral Asian action with loud protests, most were secretly glad that the Chinese and their allies had acted decisively and broken the stalemate imposed on the world by Western ideological divisions. The Chinese assured everybody that they were monitoring the effects of injecting such large amounts of sulfur into the stratosphere and would stop the process at once if there were unforeseen adverse effects, after which the atmosphere would return to normal in about a year. Besides, they were only seeking to replicate the cooling effect created by natural volcanic eruptions that boosted comparable amounts of the same substances into the stratosphere. What could go wrong? Elements of the left in many Western countries demanded their governments use force to stop the dangerous experiment, but even in the few countries where the left controlled the government, nobody seriously contemplated war with China. It might be a dreadfully crippled giant after the beating it had taken from the climate in the past decade, but it was still a giant. Moreover, many people on the left were secretly curious to see if this kind of geoengineering could solve the problem that dominated their lives and threatened their futures. For a year and a half, the balloons rose every day, and by late 2040, a pronounced cooling effect was clearly evident all around the planet. It wasn't all the way back to the normal of the late 20th century, but it was like being back in the 2020s again. Then Mount Toba erupted. And it goes on, of course, and Mount Toba gives you 3 degrees of cooling, and all the crops have been designed to deal with 2 degrees of warming, and you lose 35% of the global crop, mass starvation, etc. One does this sort of thing to get attention, obviously. But scenarios are useful.
Thank you very much, Gwynne. It's funny that you mentioned how your understanding of the technologies and such changed between when you wrote the book and today, and it's not surprising. Look back on some of the first stuff that I wrote back in 2004 about geoengineering, and I definitely understand more, but also I've noted that my perspective on it changed. I'm curious, for any of you can jump in on this, how has your perspective on geoengineering, on climate engineering, changed from when you first wrote about it to today?
Oh, all right then.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was actually a virgin when I first wandered into this. I knew no more than the average headline writer. Well, all right, a little bit more, but not a great deal. I hadn't actually, I guess I'd heard the phrase geoengineering, but I hadn't, parsed it beyond, that over there, So there's a very steep learning curve. It doesn't take that long to get up. You learn the words and how they join up and so on. But I suspect that I am probably, what I do notice is that the learning curve lasts about a year, and I've learned very little since then. I went to Asilomar, and I'm here again today, and I'm here just to sort of catch up, but I'm actually finding I'm not out of breath trying to catch up. It's not moving that fast. I'm in the state of knowledge. There's many more things on the table, but all of them in a very embryonic phase.
Right.
Like you, Jamais, I have more than a bit of the science fiction in me. I first learned about this stuff, I think there was a AAAS session on it in 1992 in San Francisco. And I think I had breakfast in McDonald's with Granger Morgan. And he filled me in on the stuff that was in the NAS report from then. And when I came back to the subject, having made a detour via Mars and Freelance Life and I was working at Nature, and after Paul Crutzen's 2006 paper came out, I became interested again, and to some extent what I wrote in a feature in Nature in 2007 is still, to some extent, the heart of what I believe. I've learned more about the science, but I've also had it's proved to me a very useful way to deepen my understanding of many other non-scientific things. When I first claimed to be writing a book on geoengineering, I had the idea that it would be considerably shorter and sharper than my more discursive previous books on planetary processes about Mars and about photosynthesis. And that's proved to be almost the opposite of the experience. As I've worked on it, I've found, especially, I don't know if Jim Fleming's here, but the work of Jim and various other historians has helped me understand the background of how we think about the climate system in a way that I think enriches how I write about geoengineering, and has certainly helped me in my thinking about it. So I kind of agree, to sort of like getting up to, you can still go quite a long way in terms of most of what you need to write an article by reading the Royal Society report. But there's an awful lot of other texture and stuff that's accumulated in the journey for me.
Thank you.
Shall I add in too? Because, of course, I'm very much a product of how Germany is discussing technology issues. And my attitude did not really change. I find it an interesting idea which will not work. And I found that at the first time I heard it. Because political processes and that kind of complex technological solutions, in my view, do not work. And what mainly shaped that view, and actually in a wider German public too, is mainly the experience of nuclear power. It is a highly complex technological system, and we Germans mostly do not believe that it works. And that is how we see many other technological solutions which we cannot see as solutions. And so that is my attitude. It did not really change. And the more I think about it and the more I write about it, the more difficult I find it to solve such problems. I mean, it is rather easy to find a climate contract for the world compared with this. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal on geoengineering back in 2009, and I was warned not to look at the comments afterwards. And some brave friends of mine who looked in on it said that easily 99% of them were attacking the Wall Street Journal for daring to write something that would suggest that climate change is real. Not surprising. But I'm curious, have any of you had particularly striking or notable reactions from readers when you write about geoengineering?
No. I had a reaction, I guess, from readers, though David Carr, in a lovely documentary about the New York Times, said you can either write for the New York Times or read the New York Times, but life isn't long enough to do both. But it seems like the New York Times does read itself, because I wrote an op-ed in, I don't know, sometime in the early zeros that was tangentially linked to this. A friend of mine called Ewan Nisbet, who's a geologist at Royal Holloway in London, had been pointing out to me in a bar that the glaciers on Mount Kilimanjaro are in a lot of trouble. And that if you were to wrap them up in an insulating fabric, they would not be in a lot of trouble. Or at least they would persist. And he was interested in this because, as an earth scientist, he wants to preserve the ice core data within them. He's also interested in this because, as an African, he values the white on top of Kilimanjaro. And I like this idea. I should point out that there's significant doubt as to whether the recession of the glaciers on Kilimanjaro is a real effect. Whether it's due to local environmental effects or global effects is, I think, still probably open to question. But I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, which I did in those days occasionally, suggesting that the obvious opportunity here was to have the artist Christo wrap up the glaciers at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro and thus have an artwork that people would visit and that would say something about the 21st century. And very unusually, the New York Times wrote an editorial the day after denouncing this idea and saying that it would be a better thing if the glaciers were allowed to vanish, leaving the bare top of Kilimanjaro as a monument to human folly. And leaving aside I found it an odd response, both in terms of aesthetics, but also in terms of the amount of concern it showed for the Tanzanian Tourist Authority.
Excellent. Well, not excellent, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
I'd actually like to open it up to the audience and see if any of you have any questions you'd like to ask our distinguished guests. I'm looking for hands waving around. A very quiet group of people. Over here. Clive. Microphone run.
Thank you. I was just intrigued with Dagmar's comment where you said that you were convinced that it was a technology that would not work. But of course, that does not mean that it is a technology that will not be implemented. And you referred to nuclear power. So is it true that you think that a technology that doesn't work will be implemented?
no, of course not. Otherwise, I would not write about that stuff, probably. Of course, a technology is not only the techniques of something. It is how a technology is seen in a society, how the rules are made to use that technology, how the implementation in various factories is, like a nuclear power station, where you have a situation where the people who are doing that are very confident they can handle it. They are so confident that a lot of mistakes happen. And that is the way of, or that is what I mean when I say a technology that doesn't work. It is more the complex whole thing I'm looking at. Of course, single technologies might work in a technical way, but they might not solve our problems. That is what I tried to refer to. It was a bit too short, I give you that.
What I've found very interesting about the conversations we've been hearing for the past few days is that it's clear that not only is climate engineering a scientific dilemma, and not only is it very much a political dilemma, it's also an emotional one. And I'm wondering, given the time that you spent looking at this, the time you spent thinking about climate engineering, does the work that's being done, do your thoughts about climate engineering actually make you feel more or less optimistic about our potential to avoid catastrophic climate disruption?
I think it's quite likely our only possibility of avoiding catastrophic climate change, whether it works or not. But I don't see anything else that I can plausibly believe is going to deliver adequately in time. But if you want me to give you a politically aware answer, and I don't mean politically correct, I just mean feed in the politics now. The reason I had the initiative coming from the third world is I cannot believe we would ever get our knickers sufficiently out of a twist to do it. If you look at, take the case of nuclear power. Personally, I'm with Jim Lovelock. You want to put a nuclear reactor in my garden? Fine. Just cut my electricity bill. The very complex, nuanced, and deeply conflicted attitudes that Western people have to nuclear power, in my view, on little evidence, but that doesn't matter, it simply doesn't exist outside of, shall we say, NATO.
Okay.
You don't have these conversations in China or in India or in Russia. Even after Chernobyl, you don't have them in Russia. And yeah, you have them in Japan, which has got a case of a version that is probably even more severe than Germany's now, though nobody died, you know. But outside of the old developed world, these hesitations do not exist, and it is elsewhere that the need will be felt first and most, just because of the geographical location of most of the emerging economies. So I think they'll do it. They may force us to go along with it, lest we be left without a vote at all in how it's done. But I think that's where the initiative will come from, and understandably.
The idea of an anti-colonial geoengineering coalition strikes me rather funny. I don't think it will work like that, because you're right, a lot of the reasoning which we have, especially in Germany, we probably are the most reasoning people in the world, is not there in many other countries. But there are other political debating lines which are interfering with the kind of solution that is given or could be given by geoengineering. And then again, we are in a colonial debate. And that is the reason why I don't think it would work. It is so easy to mobilize people on such issues which can be seen as a colonial thing, even if it is like an anti-colonial project. At a certain point, the debate kicks in the other direction, because people start thinking about, what are we doing here? Is this really serious? Is this not only a fake of our political class? And that kind of debates, they are going on actually in Africa, where I follow the debates, in a very short time period. And it can change any time, that's true. But that is the reason why I don't think this could be a stable pathway which we can go. And so I really doubt that geoengineering will help us very much. And in fact, in my view, the climate problem will not be solved. What we will do is try to negotiate ourselves around the question, who is paying for what in the end. Yeah.
I think your question, Jamais, was, does thinking about and writing about geoengineering make me more or less optimistic? To which I think the honest answer is probably yes.
Okay. So that by thinking about, by considering these things, and where I was going with this wasn't so much do you think it's going to happen or do you think it's going to succeed, it's more does it make you, when you read about this, when you write about this, do you come back with we're really in trouble if we're considering this, or we really might actually get our stuff together?
Well, I think what I'm trying to do, with probably very limited success, is to raise the question to some extent of what it is. One of the things that I find, and it actually goes back to our question about how quickly can you get up to speed with geoengineering. If you think that geoengineering is about a bunch of technical solutions, which are technical activities, which are all which we've all heard discussed here, sure. But if you think geoengineering more as a stance, then it's actually rather more difficult to understand. And I think what I'm interested in doing, what I'm trying to do, is find ways to interrogate the stance that you take, and particularly to see how you talk about geoengineering if you're not thinking just about the climate. So some of you know I'm very interested in the nitrogen cycle, which I consider an example of geoengineering. And what you do when you start explicitly trying to avoid thinking in terms of control and maybe try to think in terms of care instead. I think the control metaphor is powerful and disturbing, but I don't think it's the only intellectual stance that you can take. So that's kind of what I'm trying to explore.
Thank you. So any more questions out here in the audience? Okay, right there. Please stand up and tell us who you are.
Hello, my name's Amy Green. I'm also from the EISS, who hosts this event. And I'm wondering about narratives. There's the disaster narrative, which nobody wants to hear about, but I have the feeling the public actually has understood climate change as a disaster narrative, even though they don't want to hear it anymore. And I'm wondering which narratives you use. It's tempting to use the fairy godmother narrative that this might be something that you could just sprinkle out there and it solves all our problems. Obviously, that's not what you're saying. But I was wondering if you could comment about narratives to use. I'm interested in this caring one, but how do you communicate that complicated issue and make an interesting narrative that the public would want to listen to? Thank you.
Me, I guess.
You can jump on it if you want.
Well, I don't particularly want to, but I will. Narrative, a story is generally required. A narrative is generally required if you're going to write anything more than about 200 words. I mean, to take, would you not agree? I mean, you need some sort of narrative to lead, you no doubt will lead them through lead the readers through a great deal of stuff that isn't essential to the narrative, but that you did want to mention. But to keep them with you, there's got to be some narrative thread they can follow. So, I mean, in the nature of the business of doing journalism, you are looking for narrative, and sometimes you're frankly inventing it. So in itself, that's, you know, a hallmark of the trade. You can't get really away from that unless you're doing little filler paragraphs. On the other hand, narratives can be extremely destructive or misleading, so you have to watch out what you're doing here. They need to be plausible, and they'd better not even inadvertently raise confusing issues. I mean, I'll give you an example. If I were writing about geoengineering, which I do from time to time, though I must admit not all that frequently, but isn't a book, I would never refer to either nuclear power or to any other highly controversial technological issue that people are already divided and settled on. Because if you do that, they'll know which side to take in this debate.
Right.
You just shut the debate down. So there's that sort of thing you need to avoid. Don't make those comparisons, because it just gives people an easy hook to hang their hat on, and they don't have to read the rest of it. They know they're for it or they know they're against it. That sort of thing is necessary. Narrative is necessary. You get better at it with practice, like most things. And it's extremely powerful, and one has to recognize that. A story that convinces is far more convincing than a bunch of facts.
Yep. So I saw other hands out there, so right up there.
There's a whole bunch over there.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Yasmin Link. I just wanted to add one more perspective to the discussion. I was wondering how you would reflect on religions within your scenario or specific cultures. I mean, you've mentioned the political dimension of third world state or colonial structures, and how do religions play into that game? Thank you.
Do either of you want to jump on that, or?
I always try to avoid religions in my texts because
It's actually
they are already controversial enough, and I do not really need that kind of controversy in it too. And because people and peoples are so different in their cultures and their way of living, I doubt that this narrative would lead me anywhere. So I keep it out.
It's interesting. I think you can't, actually want to circle back on both of these things. You can't really, to some extent, write about how people feel about the environment, certainly within a Western context, and probably more generally, without having some position or some sensitivity to what they see as sacred. And I think that does inform how I work. I really actually kind of agree with more or less everything Gwynne says about narrative, except to the extent that I don't actually do it very much, which is probably why I don't sell many books. But I tend to try and, I don't want to convince people particularly. I want to enrich people's imaginations. And I'm sure that in some ways, my lack of really defined sense of what I myself want means that I'm not sure that I'm desperately trying to convince other people. So I tend to use interleaved chronologies, basically, as a primary tool. There are sort of like dozens of them in the other books that sort of like layer onto each other, and that's kind of what I'm doing this time, and that's probably not satisfactory in narrative ways, but it gets to the question that I think was behind the religion question, which is how do you deal with cultural difference? I'm not a particularly gifted person at that in many ways, but I have a certain amount of, I think, historical empathy. I find it easier to talk about the past cultures of the places that I am now than to look around contemporary culture, and in some ways I also find that more illuminating of where we are. So my cultural diversity, and to some extent my respect or lack of it for religion in what I do, tends to come from the historical dimension.
So we have more questions over here. No? Catherine.
Yeah, I wanted to start just by acknowledging when
Catherine,
Oliver read out
could you
his...
stand up and tell us who you are?
Oh, my name is Catherine Bush, and I'm a writer. I'm a novelist, actually. And I just wanted to acknowledge Oliver's lovely description of the stratosphere in what you read to us from the opening, and how lovely that was in this context to bring us actually, imaginatively and visually to the stratosphere. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the stratosphere, or we spent a lot of time talking about it over the last couple of days. But I thought what you did so beautifully was to bring us there. And that's one of the things that, that fiction does, takes us other places, but journalism can also do. And whether it's narrative or not, I think that ability to imaginatively take us elsewhere is so important. But I actually just wanted to ask a couple of questions. I mean, there are things I could say, but I was curious about the question of audience in terms of shaping your work around an issue like climate engineering. Do you think about perceived audience? Does that shape how you write what you write about in this context? And do you see yourself as having a role as a writer in shaping the public debate and a responsibility, and how does that shape what you're doing?
Dagmar?
Of course, it always shapes what I write, because I write for an audience which I want to read my text. I mean, if I would not think about the audience when I write, then I would probably never find a reader. And I work for a not bad daily newspaper, but it's a rather small daily newspaper, and it's definitely not important enough to shape any debates, so I keep myself out of that.
Oliver, do you have a sense? Take on
I think about my audience's responses, but I'm not seeking a particular audience. I mean, at some level, I want people who take an interest in mildly literary nonfiction to think this is an interesting thing for them to do. Some people, I've been described as a nature writer, which was one of the nicer surprises of my previous year. So people who buy nonfiction of that sort, I think that they should give me a try. I kind of want you guys, at least some of you guys, to read this book. I kind of want people who think about, I really want people who think about geoengineering to read this book. That's not going to make me a lot of money, but there's not, as I say, that's kind of why I have a day job as well.
Gwynne?
I don't have a day job as well, so I have to think about the audience quite a lot, but, well, that is the day job. I just either do it from home or in airplanes, But the column I write's used in 45 countries. So, I mean, you can't have an image of, it's a Japanese audience, it's an Indian audience, an African audience, Middle Eastern audience, European audience, North American audience. So you either go lowest common denominator, and when you've figured out what none of those groups will hate, you have nothing left to say, or else you just say the hell with it and write what you think. And what's amazing is, as long as you aren't abusive, you can get away with it. I mean, and they go on sending me checks from all these places. So, I mean, presumably somebody's reading the stuff. And it's a real lesson. I mean, I will admit, 25 years ago, I didn't have that global audience. I wrote for basically countries who were in the NATO group, plus some other English-speaking countries, because the rest of the world either had no money to pay or was under various kinds of dictatorships. Now they aren't, and most of them do have money, and you've got this enormously expanded audience, and yet you can access them all with, I don't change the text, everybody gets the same. Goes out to 200 papers twice a week. And I get very little hate mail, almost none. Maybe they're just not sending it on.
Maybe they don't know your address. We are actually now hurtling ever closer to 3 p.m. And I just want to let you know there's actually something special that's happening outside, right outside the doors. And that is Carolina Sobecka is actually, as part of her art project, Thinking Like a Cloud, has invited us all to a cloud tasting. So that's right outside the door right now. And I'd like to just invite you to thank our wonderful guests and enjoy your cloud.